Hi, everyone. Morning. So before I introduce my fellow panelists here, I just wanted to take a little temperature of the room. And so, if you identify as a member of a movement, whether that's a student movement, labor movement, movement for Black Lives, climate change, how about you put up your left hand? Yeah. Left, to the left. All right, keep those up. If you identify as a journalist or aspiring journalist, put up your right hand. All right, so I think we have a good sense of who's in this room. And we're gonna try and help you think through, and you're gonna try and help us think through, actually, some of the pitfalls and questions that surround covering movements, particularly today in the age of Trump. So next to me is Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is a Nation Institute reporting fellow and the author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. And Sarah just got back from Ireland. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Is that
so
why
we're
you're
gonna
wearing green?
talk about that.
Not why I'm wearing green, but it helps.
Next to her is Lizzy Ratner. Lizzy is a senior editor at The Nation, where she oversees the magazine's Cities Rising series, which looks at progressive urban resistance. And Lizzy just put together a really great special issue on the housing movement. So maybe we'll talk about that a little. Next to her is Collier Meyerson. I always get this wrong. Meyerson? Meyerson.
No, Myers.
Myers.
I was like, I thought it was Myers.
Collier is a Nobler Fellow at the Nation Institute and a contributing writer for The Nation. And she's won 2 National Association for Black Journalists Awards and an Emmy. Okay.
Emmy?
Finally, Wright is a columnist for The Nation magazine and an editor and host for New York Public Radio. And while Kai was at The Nation, he launched 2 podcasts with NPR, WNYC there. There Goes the Neighborhood, which is about gentrification, and United States of Anxiety, which is about Trump voters. So, let's just start with Sarah here. So you were in Ireland covering a movement.
Yes.
And so my question for you is what were your questions when you went there, and how did you, go about answering them?
Yeah, so my first bit of advice to people who want to cover movements is always make it your beat, and you have to actually commit to this. And so, of course, I'm flying to a country where I don't live to cover a movement that I have not been attached to for that long.
So what were you doing there? I'm sorry.
I was covering the referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment to the Irish Constitution, which is commonly referred to as an abortion ban, but we should understand it, particularly in the US context, as a fetal personhood amendment. It gave the unborn the same rights as the person within which it is residing. And in practice, that had a lot of horrific consequences, not just for people who wanted an abortion, but for people who were seeking to make their own decisions about their health care while pregnant. And so this amendment went in by popular referendum in 1983, at the same time as most countries were liberalizing abortion law. Ireland went in the other direction. And so there has been a 35-year movement to try to get rid of this thing that finally succeeded in winning an overwhelming 67% of the population, higher than the marriage referendum in 2015, we should say, and higher than the amount of people who voted to put the damn thing in the first place. Really, really overwhelming success, much more than, I should say, most of the people that I interviewed on the ground thought it was going to be. And so to go in and do this, I've been to Ireland many times. I have a lot of connections over there at this point. I know people who are involved in various movements, including the campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment, and in particular, because I'm a labor reporter most of the time, within the trade union campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment. And so the challenge was really figuring out how to do this justice in a week, which I can't. There's no way. There's no way to do justice to all of the weird permutations of Irish politics in a week. And I'm writing for a US audience, so I had to figure out how to actually translate this thing to the people that are actually going to be reading my piece, while also trying to actually do justice to the context these people are organizing in, which is, in many cases, very rural parts of a very Catholic, very conservative country in some ways. In other ways, a very not conservative country. And that whole tension was it's a lot. It was a lot to do. But it was also incredible because I spent a lot of time canvassing in rural conservative Ireland, watching people go door to door and have conversations about a topic that we are constantly told in this country, which has a pro-choice majority that we know of, that we can't talk about because it's too divisive.
Did you, when you were there, I'm just curious, did you also get to talk to some of the no campaigners? And
Some, I mean, honestly, like, they don't want to talk to me. For perhaps unsurprising reasons. And the other interesting thing about that was that they had a lot of American money funding them. But, you know, I did talk to a lot of no voters while out with canvassers, you know, and that was actually more interesting than sort of the I know what the shtick is, right? But to actually hear people thinking through how they were going to vote and why was very illuminating in a lot of ways.
Kai, I wanted to ask you, because we've known each other a long time, girl.
We're very young people, so we could have only known each other for a few minutes.
Right. You know, you have actually worked at a lot of different places, and some, I think, would sort of be called movement newspapers. The Blade was an LGBT. I don't think Q was added
We
to that
didn't yet have
yeah.
Q, no.
That's how old we are. And you know, very much a movement newspaper. You've worked at Color Lines, which I think also is a racial justice movement publication. You've worked at The Nation, which you know, I would say is adjacent and allied with many movements. Yep. But you've also worked in public radio, which doesn't and explicitly does not have a movement affiliation, and the Daily News, which does not have a movement affiliation. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how have those homes changed the way you approach journalism and covering movements, and how have you navigated, you know, that?
So to take those things separately, you know, no, it hasn't changed how I approach it. My approach in general has been, you know, to the having the both hands up, is it's made a little easier by the fact that my interest in, I see my relationship to movement in context and providing context for the work that movements are doing. You know, I mean, I think one of the most important parts of movement is challenging the frame in which we talk about things. You know, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about life, or are we talking about personhood amendments? You know, how do we frame the debates we're in? And I think that and I see my work as a journalist in its relationship to movement to be helping in the framing debate. And so whether I was at The Nation, at Color Lines, at New York, and now at WNYC, I'm constantly making a case for, wait, how do we think about this story? What it's not just the events that we're covering, it's what the events add up to. What is the context? That's the debate. And I have actually found, and that's regardless of what kind of journalism you're doing, whether you're doing mainstream journalism or ideologically driven journalism, everybody kind of agrees on that. You know, everybody's comfortable having an argument about what is the framework. So most of the politics enters my work through what frame I choose to take, and then once you're inside the frame, from there you're just doing journalism. You know, and so. Can
I just ask you to unpack, because I think that question of framing is really interesting, but let's maybe make it a little concrete. So, like, when you were doing, let's say, the United States of Anxiety podcast, like, because I remember having these conversations with you, like, and there was a lot of journalism about Trump voters. Like, everyone was parachuting into, like, Ohio to figure out, like, what the hell is going on with these white people, right? And I think, you know, you kind of chose a different frame for that a little bit, and so can you like talk about that in that context?
And so the framework for that became the sort of, as the name would imply, the freak out that was happening in white suburbs, right? That this is a generation of people, this is sort of the second generation of whites, post-white flight from cities, and they're looking around their neighborhoods, and a lot of the stuff that they had run from, that their parents had run from, was now at their doorstep. There were people of color in their neighborhoods. Their children were not doing as well as they did for a whole host of reasons. And so the frame of it became like, what the sort of the disintegration of the idea that white people build for themselves in the suburbs in our parents' generation, our being me and Richard's, and Lizzie's,
And the other one.
and so once that wasn't a challenging, that's sort of a sociological framework that everybody from New York Public Radio to the Nation could get down with, like, oh, we're examining why. So then our question became why? Why are they feeling this way? Now, for me, the reason I'm pursuing these questions is because these people are a bodily threat to me and the people I care about and the movements that I identify with. For other colleagues I have, they were pursuing those questions because they have a vague interest in democracy and they want to know what's going on. Or people can as journalists, enter that in all kinds of different ways, but we could have a real fight about what is the story about. And then once we're to the reporting, we're just reporting. Once we decided what it was about, we all agree on how you report. We went and we talked to voters and we took them seriously and we fact-checked their claims and we were fair about how we presented their information. Those are fundamentals that it doesn't matter what you're covering. I think where you really run into where the problem becomes is in deciding what the story is about. And I should say I think we have that problem in. There's a certain kind of conversation I have to have at a place like WNYC around that, but there's a conversation I have to have in more movement aligned spaces too. That is literally the editorial conversation we have every week at the magazine. What is this actually about? And there's widespread disagreement. So I think that stage of the discussion, it's what matters more than whether or not I'm a movement person or not.
I like that lesson of making it explicit, right? Just putting that on the table as a conversation we're going to have before we start this project. What is the framework? What are the different ways that we come into this project?
And I would say, just to add, it's because that's a good point, is that I think more sort of mainstream, quote unquote, journalists just don't have the muscle. Haven't developed the muscle enough to have that first explicit conversation about what this is about. They're much more likely to just run out and start reporting. I don't mean that dismissively, but like they're much more likely to say, let's go get all the facts, and then that leaves them much more likely to accept the hegemonic narrative about the facts.
Right. Who are the sources I already know that I've interviewed last week also, right? Yeah. Collier, I wanted to ask you because I think this has been a really whiplash 2 years for movements, and I think perhaps quite acute for the movements you cover. Just going from I think a position where there were some real gains being made and some real big ideas about mass incarceration or poverty or being put on the agenda to really being in a defensive crouch. And how has that changed, how you cover this, and how are your communities sort of thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that there was a moment when Donald Trump got elected and everyone was like, all right, now we're gonna go in like extra hard, like all of the movement people that I spoke with. But what actually ended up happening was this like intense fatigue just took over everyone, just like, I like thought that we were making these like at least incremental changes, that we were at least on the map, and now, besides the sort of shock and awe of it, like now I'm tired. And I think that from the outside of movement, of being inside the outside of being inside of a movement, journalists were like, oh, the Black Lives Matter movement has all but come to a stop, or like, the LGBTQ plus movement with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, or student-based movements at your various schools, and so I had to sort of, I was also experiencing fatigue as a journalist that covered all of these things. When I don't know how much you guys were a part of these movements, but there's such energy inside campus-wide movements, and I also fed off of that energy, and then I also then felt the fatigue that everybody else was feeling, and the despair, right? So I had to sort of recalibrate myself and figure out how I was going to cover it. And the first thing I did, because I am very sort of explicit about not being an activist and not being a person in movements. That's like a way for me to sort of psychologically separate myself, because I think I would then become too invested. So what I did was I just relied on the folks who are the activists in the movement people and called them. And one of the most revelatory moments for me actually came quite recently when I was speaking with Alicia Garza, who is one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, for simplicity's sake. And she said to me, yes, I get this question all the time. Like, let me just break this down for you. Like, think about every movement in history. And she knows that I'm like a really intense student of history. I think there's a McAllister College person here, right? Hey. So I studied history in college, and especially American history, right? So that was something I was really interested in. So as soon as she said that, I was like, yeah, okay, let me think. Like SNCC, like of all the different organizations that I've studied in my life, right? Like everything from during Jim Crow to slavery to the civil rights movement to the, Chicano movement to whatever movement it is, like there's actually like a pretty finite amount of time that those movements last. And it's like a couple years. Like, actually, like we learn about these things as being these sort of like mammoth, like incredible, like everlasting, ever impactful movements. And they are, which I do believe Black Lives Matter was and still will remain. But then people get tired and they start to also shift their attention to, in this case with Alicia, electoral politics. And it's all part of a strategy, a long game, right? So I think that there were all of these stories that came out post-Trump winning that were like, oh, these movements are dead. And that wasn't like, to piggyback off of Kai, that isn't actually the right way to sort of like look at what was happening. Like, yes, there weren't like, people in the streets all the time because people get tired and you can't always be in the streets. So what's a good journalistic tactic? Okay, these people they didn't disappear. What happened to them? So you really have to then go out and find out what they're doing instead of being in the streets and being a talking head on MSNBC. And they are doing stuff, right? So that's some of the work that I've been doing, but I also didn't know that, right? Like I had to have somebody like tell me like, oh yeah, we didn't go away, girl. Like we're here. Like here's what we're doing. So that's been part of my work since the sort of like in the streets dramatic BLM stuff.
And then Lizzy, to you, just to piggyback on that, I think cities, the way we could think about them as these cauldrons of contesting movements, multiple movements who are sometimes allied with each other, sometimes fighting each other for resources, sometimes forming on top of each other. And so I just wanted to ask you, how do you approach kind of covering that? And specifically, to the housing issue you put together. I thought, one of the interesting questions about that you approached that issue with is like, there wasn't one, right? And now there might be one. And so how do you...
So I'm going to approach that obliquely. I'm going to sort of like wiggle my way, hopefully, into an answer there. And I'm going to do that by actually jumping off what Collier was saying, because I think a really important thing about movements is we see them, we become aware of them when they blow up, when they get big, when the media decides to cover them. But a lot like evolution, there's stuff happening for a long, long time. We don't just see a new species form, right? There's like a gazillion mutations and nature's doing its business for a very long time before something actually becomes, gets on our radar as being new. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of quiet work that is being done. And so I think I have been covering cities, or I've been editing stories about cities and kind of the progressive ferment that's been bubbling up in cities for a number of years. And I started doing this around 2014. So think back 4 years ago, Obama was president, Donald Trump was a reality show dude, Ivanka and Jared were socialites. I don't know what was happening in pop culture because I'm kind of a nerd, but you get the picture. And at that time, we started covering cities because we noticed that at the federal level, a lot was gummed up. There had been the sequester, there had been a government shutdown, there had been multiple threats of a shutdown, all these sort of visions we'd had, perhaps naively when Obama was elected, of overturning the Bush era and the decades of neoliberal this and that had preceded Obama. That wasn't coming to pass for a number of reasons. But basically, our hopes were not being realized at the federal level. But at that very moment, we realized, oh my gosh, the fight for 15 is bubbling up in cities. And after 20 years, New York City has a mayor who at least describes himself as progressive, right? After Giuliani and Bloomberg. We had the movement against stop and frisk, which ultimately Black Lives Matter hadn't yet broken out onto the scene, but you had a very active movement against police brutality and sort of stop and frisk and broken windows sort of has come back. But anyhow, so we realized that really the progressive action is taking place at the local level. So we started following things in cities. And then 3 years later, 2 years later, I guess 2.5 years later, Donald Trump gets elected, and all of a sudden, some movements seem a little bit to fade into the background, but we see all this other activism, right? When Donald Trump announces that he, the refugee ban, the Muslim ban, you see people pour out into the streets. They're going to the airports, and again, a lot of people were like, oh my God, where'd this come from? This is amazing, it's all about Trump. But if you actually had kind of looked back in time, kind of done an archaeology, and peeled back the layers, you would see that a lot of these movements were forming beforehand. And in some ways, particularly if you look at sort of all the wonderful, amazing activism that's been happening against Islamophobia, that goes back to post 9/11 era, and it's been building and building and building. So I guess this is not what you asked, but one thing I want to say is when you cover movements, we get excited when we, about the here and now, what they're doing, but they have a history, they have a past, and that past is critical to know if you want to understand the movement in a deep way, and to recognize, again, that this isn't spontaneous. It takes a lot of work to build a movement. So, okay, so I don't know, I've been talking a lot. I can answer the housing question, or I can let you go on.
I actually think you did answer the question in a way, which
Right.
is that, and one thing I loved really about the pair of articles that you put together is it told the whole backstory and the context of this movement that didn't go away, right? And is not emerging now out of nowhere, but actually had multiple prongs that were sort of dormant, agitating, all along. I wanted to ask just quickly everyone here, because I know there was a question about this at the end of the last panel, and I know it's going to come up on this one, which is the objectivity question, right? Or how do you, as a journalist, position yourself in relation to movements that you maybe are in, maybe are allied with, sympathetic to? How do each of you think about it? Because I actually think all of you might have slightly different answers to this, which would be interesting. So, do you want to just go down the line here? Yeah.
Nobody's objective. That's just true. Nobody's objective. I'm not objective. Chuck Todd's not objective. Kai's not objective. Lizzy's not objective. We're not. We have opinions about what we think is going on. And that creeps into every single story. Everyone, whether they're making a conscious decision, I think Kai's point was really good about how they're framing the story, about what they think the story is about. Every reporter who writes a story or presents a story on television or the radio is making a decision about what they think the story is about. It might be a lazy decision, but they're still making a decision. That said, I constantly have to balance what and how I'm relating to the subjects of the stories that I'm in, or that I'm writing. And, you know, people constantly, sometimes as a way to like sort of shut me up, will refer to me as an activist journalist. It's usually honestly said by people who want to belittle my work as not as serious as somebody who works for the New York Times. And I bet everybody on this panel has gotten this.
Yep.
And my answer to that is, well. But I do have constant tension, and I think that more than any answer, it is the tension that you have to hold in your head of how involved am I in this thing? How much of a relationship do I have to this thing? When am I going to bow out of covering something because I know people who are involved in it too well to be, you know, and it's not to be objective, but it's, am I going to hold off on going hard on this because I like this person? Am I going to go too hard on this because I don't like this person, which is also a fair question. How deeply can I get involved in any one of these things is just a question that I ask myself every single time I'm writing a story, every single time I'm doing an interview, every time I'm thinking about anything. And I think one of the things that it's important is for people to just know where I'm coming from. And that's not hard to do if you have read my work or follow me on Twitter. But it is, you know, the question of how you interact with all of these things is just an ongoing process.
Lizzy, Collier, Kai?
I mean, I want to just say ditto, because that actually does parallel my thinking a lot. I would add, you know, I end up editing these days. I have covered movements, and I find it to be both thrilling and really sticky, because I can fall in love with the movement, and I have to remind myself constantly that my job is not to kind of do a hagiography. And at the same time, you know, a lot of these movements, I do want them to succeed. So I have to keep kind of pulling myself. I'm like, you know, my mind's a balloon. It wants to like fly up and get all excited. And I have to keep on yanking it down a little bit just to remind myself to not view something with overly rosy glasses, to be at least honest.
Yeah.
I don't think one needs to be objective. You're not going to be objective, but to try to be honest and to be very self-aware. So I think, yeah, having bias is fine, or not having, that didn't come out right, but having a political perspective is fine. It's just critical to be open with yourself about what that is, and then very open with your readers about what that is. So I think, yeah, that's ditto.
I'll also add that sort of the scrupulous or a reverence for fact is like incredibly important when you are a person who is known to have opinions. So I was an intern. I'm a product of the Nation. I was an intern at the Nation. I was an intern for Melissa Harris Perry. I then went to go work on her show right away after I was an intern. I then went to go work on Chris Hayes' show, who's also is he still affiliated with the Nation?
Yeah,
he's a
editor at large. Yeah. Whatever that means.
Yeah. Which is another good question that I need help understanding. Yeah. So just up front, that's my experience. But something that the Nation, which I think is one of the most vital parts of the Nation, is that keeps it sturdy and reliable, is its fact checking, its rigorous love for fact, right? So I know how to fact check, and y'all, if you just that is to me the most important part of journalism.
Yes.
Is fact checking. So I know that if I'm too invested in a character or whatever, that I can check myself by fact checking their story or fact checking what's going on. And that keeps me really honest, I have caught myself a bunch of times being oh my God, this is the perfect story and it's gonna show this movement in a very specific, good, particular light. And then a week down the line, I'm oh, that wasn't quite the way that they portrayed the situation isn't quite right, because I spoke to a person with an opposing view who then gave me like documents, you know? So let me revisit this. And it's obviously never as black and white as that. But that's a way to be really, to be a really good journalist when you are a journalist with an opinion. Like, and I mean, you're always going to be a journalist.
We're all journalists with opinions.
But like a journalist with an opinion publicly, right? So there's that. And then there's also like the fact that we are all fallible, and we can all, I'm actually just right now, don't steal my story. But a couple months ago, I wrote a story about progressive mayors, right? Like who, and the nation loves this sort of thing, right? Like who are the progressive mayors? And one of the mayors, I covered mayors from all over the country. I didn't have the opportunity to do reporting in the field for this, which I actually always find helps your story be more accurate. So I was doing all of my reporting over the phone. And of course, I missed a couple things. One of which was some people actually didn't think one of these mayors was as progressive as he was purporting to be. But there was this like national, among progressives, there was this like national like obsession with this guy.
You want to tell us who it was, Collier?
Jaffe in Jackson, Mississippi. And I get like an at on Twitter from a local journalist being like, oh, like you don't have Google? Like you couldn't see that he hasn't said like jack shit about police involved shooting in Jackson? And I was like, oh God. Like I did miss that. I missed that. And had I been in Mississippi, had I been in Jackson, I would have talked to like, you know, folks on the ground, folks in the Malcolm X grassroots organization. I didn't make that extra call. I should have made that extra call. And so now I'm like, I get word from one of my sources that 6 black people have been shot in Jackson, Mississippi, and that's a spike from before he was mayor. And there's been some sort of task force that's been put together, but it's not really like nothing's like it's weird, right? So now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, I need to go revisit the reporting I did and like make sure that, you know, now that it's been more time has passed. I think he's only coming upon his first year as mayor, so you know it's obviously a lot harder to get things done. These people who I'm talking to are grassroots organizers, and they want to see things change radically and quickly. And so I'm like, okay, let me talk to everyone involved here. As Melissa was saying before, during her panel, like, you know, you have to talk to everybody, you know, and figure out and present the information. So I'm not going to come at this story with like, oh, these grassroots organizers are right, and like this mayor is wrong, or this mayor is like, these grassroots organizers don't know what it means to be a mayor and to like have to, you know, cop to cops. You know what I mean? Like to be able to stay in that position of power is, you know, political theater and political dance is a reality. And like folks who you used to be in the Malcolm X grassroots like organizing with, like maybe don't get that as much. Like, you know, so I'm at the point where I'm like, I need to revisit this story because my reporting didn't sum up the situation that now exists in this thing, right? Like we love to hear, as people on the left, as radicals, as whatever you want to define yourself, a good story. Like we love the, like, after Bernie Sanders was Bernie Sanders, then he puts together this Our Revolution and people are winning all over the place, and that seems like a sea change and everything's happening. But like, what is happening now? Like, what are those people, what are those progressives who've been elected to those positions doing? So that's what also you need to do, is like check yourself, be in touch with your sources, make sure that you got the story right and that you continue to get the story right. And maybe the story has changed and that's not your fault, but you also need to cover that.
I love that. It's just about being really rigorous with yourself at all times. Kai, do you?
And I think I would drill down on that point to say that, I mean, well, two things. One, I think this is a much less of an important conversation than it used to be. You know, so I work for, as Richard said, a public radio station in New York. It's the largest public radio station in the country. 5 years ago, they would have never hired me. I would have been a non-starter for that newsroom. I am now run-of-the-mill for that newsroom in terms of the level of politics I have. And, you know, I look at my boss, the vice president for news, who is, you know, a middle-aged white man who spent his career at the New York Times, you know, and just the difference in the way he thinks about these questions today versus even a year ago. It's just the industry is changing on how much time and energy we waste on the cult of objectivity. But then I would say part of why that's changing, and what the good thing is, what I have always said about it is that the idea of objectivity is a very lazy way around the much deeper, harder, very real questions we need to be asking ourselves as journalists in terms of, are we being fair, thorough, and transparent? To just say we're being objective is far shorter task. It's a far insufficient task, frankly, to doing the kind of journalism that it is supposed to produce, which is fair, thorough, and transparent. So never mind, like, are we asking questions like the following? So while working on There Goes the Neighborhood, a podcast about gentrification, and I live in one of the neighborhoods that was covered. There was a day I was out. I spent a whole day with this guy who is functionally homeless. We were roaming around the neighborhood. He had grown up there. He was showing me all of his favorite spots. We spent hours together. He had a car, at which he was largely living in, and he drove me home. I own a house in that neighborhood, and he drives me up to my house, and he's like, "Oh, it's a nice place. You got a room in here?" And I was like, well, we kind of have a whole floor. It's just, I found myself like acting some kind of way around like my financial privilege relative to his. That's a question about my fairness and thoroughness and transparency on this story. I'm covering economic inequality in New York City, and I'm one of the most privileged people in the city, period. I am, and that doesn't take much in the city, but I am, right? That raises questions I need to ask myself. I used to write a ton about sexuality and about the LGBT now Q movement, but I'm a 44-year-old gay man, and frankly, I don't do it as much anymore because I don't have much to say. But really, I need to say to myself, you know what, as in my life experiences, do I have a lens? Should I shut up? Is this time for me to speak on these things? Because I don't have the right life experience here to be fair and thorough and transparent about the LGBTQ movement, right? So those are the kinds of questions that get erased in Be Objective. And those are the much deeper questions that we all need to be asking ourselves, regardless of what kind of journalism we're doing.
I would just add that in my experience, I covered the LGBTQ movement quite a lot for years, and I would actually consider it the movement I'm the most home at. And this is sort of counterintuitive, but I realized pretty soon that my job there is to be adversarial to that movement, right? It's as much as one is adversarial to corporate power, my job is to show up and ask the questions that nobody wanted to ask, to take the food fights that were happening behind the scenes and to stage and create a public in which they were debated, and to push super hard, on the different strategies, because no one else was going to do that from a position of being as informed as I was. And, after a few years, that really made me I would go to I would go to these national LGBTQ conferences, and people would be like, "Oh my God, there's Richard Kim, we have to go." Yeah, and it's hard, right? It's you hang out with these people all the time. They think you're their friend, and you actually might be. But at the end of the day, you are also asking questions that they don't necessarily always want to answer.
Yeah.
I want to reiterate that point because that can be really hard.
Very
you need
hard.
to set yourself up psychologically for that hurdle. You will have conversations with people that break your heart, or I fucked up. I actually fucked up a story. And and you will also fuck up stories. And I called them after the fact, and I was like, oh, I actually wanted to fact check this thing, even though it's been published, because I have this feeling that this like agency is going to come after me. And you also have to be paranoid. Yes. I was like, I think this agency is going to come after me, and I want to fact check your story. And she was like, oh, you sound just like them. Like, you want to fact check my story? Like, you don't believe the things I was telling you? And I melted down. I was like, oh no, this person has been traumatized forever, and I'm calling them to fact check their story, and I feel so bad. And then I was like, oh wait, that's my job. It's my job. And ultimately, it was like a bad day for me. It was a really bad day for me because I had to be like, I felt bad. Like, I felt bad for being a journalist, but I also was like, I need to like, do what's right for my organization, for me, and for this person, right? Like, if it comes out that this person strayed at all from fact, then they're screwed too, right? So it can be really hard.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I was just saying that this brings us back around to like the question of access. And that has a lot of meanings, right? When we say access, like I cover the labor movement, which means that like it's helpful if the leaders of major labor unions will talk to me still. It's also, though, very important, and what Collier is saying, the responsibility you have to your sources at various levels is actually different. Like, it's not my job to be nice to Rich Trumka. It's not. Yeah. It's my job to be honest about what kind of a job he's doing. It is my job to think about, if I'm talking to rank and file person who hasn't been media trained and doesn't actually talk to reporters for a living, to think about what they're telling me and whether I should actually publish it and how. And that kind of thing, like, fact-checking that person's story is actually your responsibility to that person, right? And I think that's really, really important. And what Richard was saying, I find myself being more of a pain in the ass to certain parts of the movements that I cover as I get older, which I think is great. I think it's my job. And it is, you do the movement no favors if you just print its press line. You do the movement absolutely no favors if you let cough certain press agencies that hire a lot of former reporters tell you what the story is, because that's usually not what the story is. And the messy stuff matters, because if you don't know how the messy stuff happened, you don't actually know how to win.
Lizzy, I see you wrestle with this all the time, right? Because we're trying to highlight these policies that we think are great, and then we have to ask tough questions about them.
Yeah, right. So, for this cities, right, I cover cities, or I have writers who cover cities, and I edit them, and the series is called Cities Rising, and really the idea is to hold up these nascent movements, and it's sort of, the idea is that it's going to act as a wire service almost, so that cities in one place will hear about the good work and the efforts that are going on in other cities. So who knew that there was a movement for public banks in this country? There is. So we publish stories about, movements for public banks in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and in the Bay Area. And, we feel part of our mission is to let people know, and we applaud this, and we're so excited. And yet we don't want to be Pollyanna. And just because people are claiming to do things doesn't mean they're actually necessarily good people, or that they're going about their work in a good way. So, or sort of a righteous or conscious or kind way. So yeah, it is a constant tension for us. And I think we act, sort of in full self-critical honesty, I think we sometimes err too much on the side of promoting these movements because we feel that progressives are embattled, that the values we hold dear are so embattled right now. So we are thrilled just when anybody is getting up there and protesting or presenting an alternative vision of the reality. So I think we often act a little bit too much like cheerleaders. In some ways, that's our mission, but I think it's important for us to kind of actually work harder to pull back at moments to say, all right, well, that movement didn't go anywhere. Or were we really honest about that mayor? And I mean, one issue that we're confronting right now is that you do have in a number of places, because there have been these progressive movements for a while, you do have people, at least self-proclaimed progressives, who are getting into power. And what happens then when they have to govern? We see it here in New York City with Bill de Blasio.
Like, you think, got anybody in mind?
Yeah, right? You know, a lot of people are disappointed. And as Collier was saying, in Jackson, Mississippi, you got, you know, Antar Chokwe Lumumba, who's somebody who in our pages, not just, you know, articles by you, but by other reporters, we have celebrated his work. But
he's done good work.
Right, but you know, how does when he's governing, what choices does he make? And we really, you know, what are the forces he's pushing up against? What are the forces he's not pushing up against? Those are critical things we have to look at. One other thing I know, just on the sort of objectivity or sort of the covering movements. You know, we've been talking about sort of being very honest about movements and the places they might have flaws and not looking away from those. But I also think many of us, some of us are allied with the movements we cover. Others are just movements that tackle issues we care about, you know, in a deep moral way. But as journalists, we often come at it from positions of privilege. You know, if you're covering farm workers, many of us have not been farm workers or may not have parents who are farm workers. And so there is kind of an inherently parasitic quality about journalism. And if you think about it, it can be really gross. We justify it by saying we are, you know, going to where the silence is, to steal a quote from Amy Goodman. We are telling the stories. We're giving voice to the voiceless. But I'm saying that with like horrible, you know, scare quotes. But I think there is, you know, without putting it in such gross terms, I think many of us, I do, justify the work I do by saying, you know, I'm on the side of good, or I'm working for good, I'm trying to tell these important stories. But sometimes people's stories are all they have. And so the way you treat those stories is really important. Not necessarily pushing people to tell the story of a horrible rape or a horrible traumatic event. And, you know, as a journalist, our audience, might actually, you know, some people say, my loyalty is to my audience. That's true. And we always have to be skeptical, but sometimes your loyalty is also, despite everything we've just said, to these people whose stories are being entrusted to us.
See, and that's why I feel like, you know, again, it's just the wrong set of questions to ask about, because ultimately the fundamental question as a journalist is, what is your mission? Like, how do you orient yourself to this work you're doing, you know? And it's actually not that, like, oh, I believe in this movement, then you should be an organizer, right? Like, that's not the mission, you know? Is your mission that I think power, wherever it resides, must be questioned, you know, like, to take Richard's framing? Like, is that your mission? Is your mission that, like, I think that the world is not black and white, and the public conversation always makes it black and white, and I think we only gain if we state the nuance, you know? Is it that the wrong people are heard from? What is your mission? Like, why are you doing that? And then there's a million ethical questions that come from that mission, right? And you have to be able to measure your mission against the ethical quandary you're in that day. And it's never, there's never a straightforward rule book about it, you know?
Sarah, quickly, and
One
then I want
quick
to take
thing,
questions.
When Lizzy said you know, people, we can think that our loyalty is to our audience. If you don't think about the people you cover as your audience, then you become that person who is that middle class person who's going in and sort of bringing back, and this happened a lot with Trump voter stories, it happens a lot with farm workers, it happens a lot with sort of sad poor people stories. If you don't think about those people as the people who are reading your story and who need to see themselves reflected back, that will actually shape the way you tell all of these stories. When you think about who your audience is, that person that you were talking to should be in that question. And like, I've seen people do really great work on this. Like, for instance, The Nation has like made sure to translate big stories into Spanish that were mostly about Spanish-speaking workers, so that the people can actually have access to the stories that are about them.
Let's take some questions. Why don't we go in the back there? Yeah?
If you come to the mics, please, because there are mics on both sides, so please don't be shy.
And that way you're recorded for posterity.
So you have to be nice.
Oh dear.
So just to go off what we were talking about on the demographic, I guess, that you're writing for in your audience, I think a lot of the reason journalism or people are not trusting media outlets is the humanization aspect and contextual aspect has kind of been lost. But I guess I'm trying to figure out a way to shorten this question, but how important is it to relate your article to the audience you're writing on? So an example I'm thinking of is gentrification and affordable housing. I had to do a bunch of case studies and articles on affordable housing units in predominantly white, suburban, affluent neighborhoods to a bunch of parents who were concerned about the stigma that goes along with affordable housing. And you had to explain it in a language that was relatable to that group, I guess. So my question would be how important and how do you contextualize and humanize stories that certain crowds wouldn't necessarily relate to on an objective basis, I guess.
So panelists, I would just note that there are a lot of people lined up. So let's try and take these. Let's take two at a time, and then also maybe try and be pithy. And you don't always have to weigh in, but please do if you need to. So your question here.
Thanks. My name is Aaron Coleman, grad student at NYU, and I'm doing Black on Campus with The Nation. I wanted to ask if there are any lessons that the panel has taken as like journalists or as a publication about like in the post-Ferguson and maybe the post-Me Too like era of writing. There was a lot of questions that after like these big events people found that just haven't been being asked, like people weren't tracking how many people were killed by the police or, you know, lots of other interactions that there was just no investigation into. And I want to know what's your opinion on that. It's a little bit counter to like being too close to some of these movements. Like, have you found that there are things that are going on right now that we don't cover until a big, you know, event happens?
So a question about how to capture voice of various movements and people you're covering, and then also just sort of like information deserts where it's like, we just don't know, you know, this big thing, and how come we don't know that? So
I can answer your question. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Aaron. So I wrote a piece for the Columbia Journalism Review that was talking about Trump, how to report on racism under Trump. And one of the I use this analogy that was like, if you're in a small town and you're covering a fireman getting a cat out of a tree, the question is like, who is the fireman? Who is the cat? Who owns the cat? Who hired the fireman? How many people of color, firemen and women, fire people, are there? Gender nonconforming folks as well. And to just like approach literally every single thing somebody tells you with that mindset, like with a question, like come back with a question. So like, I just started reporting on child welfare, which is just like a grossly underreported issue, and there's just such a dearth of reporting that I've found that there are like I have no answers to any of my questions, right? Like as opposed to something that's been much more like well reported and trotted out, like criminal justice reporting, right? We know who to call for the right quote. We know who to call for the right character because we know that the person we call for the right quote has media trained the right character, right? So it makes our job really easy when we're covering criminal justice. When it's something that is like an issue that isn't reported on, we have to do all of that work. And so I think the most important thing to do is to ask yourselves, like, to every single thing that that comes at you, is ask a question about what's underneath that, and then you'll find that you have to do a FOIL request, like 12 of them or whatever, but you will get your answers or you won't, and that is a story.
So to the question over there.
I'll take that one since you mentioned specifically gentrification and housing. I mean, I think the shortest answer I can give around it is that I don't think readers, listeners, viewers have trouble hearing stories of people that aren't like them. I think that's a myth. I don't think people have that problem. I think what happens is that as journalists, we often forget the person we're talking to and interviewing and profiling is a human being, and we start thinking about them as a pull quote or as a character or as a whatever element of the story we want to tell, and they get dehumanized in the process. And I think, so I work in podcasting, and you can see it. I when I'm in these like groups of people, and there are the kinds of people who talk about their stories in the terms of characters, and there are kinds of people that talk about their stories in terms of, this woman Jane I met, and I think it's in our mindset as we're reporting and writing, just like this person I met, this is a human interaction I'm having, and as long as if you stay in that space, I think it comes out in the kind of story you tell. So it's sort of a squishy answer, but I actually think it's the most important thing.
Great. Let's take a question over here.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Candace King. I'm a grad student at UMass Amherst, and I'm also a Black on Campus fellow. You all talked about sort of the tensions and complexities about being close to the source in these movements, but I'm wondering, how do you initiate that initial relationship with your source? Because a lot of times I find, because I was a journalist before I went to grad school, a lot of people have a lot of distrust for the media, and so they don't want to talk to you. So what are some strategies for initiating that relationship? And secondly, as far as covering the sources within those movements, we have figureheads, but what are some strategies for finding those underground voices that the media doesn't always cover?
Let's take those.
Hi, these are the really important questions. You're my favorite person here now. Because it's really, part of it also is like, it gets easier when you have a body of work that you can point to, that you can say, like, this is the work that I've done that is fair to people. And so you have people who can introduce you. And that just sort of takes work, and you will have to build that in some cases on the ground. You show up to the protest that no other reporter shows up to, and you do your research and you do your homework, and you keep showing up to those places until people go like, hey, she's always here. And nobody else is here. Nobody else is at this city council meeting or this police board meeting or this whatever meeting that we're here to disrupt. And it gets easier as you become that person, and people, again, can see that you're that person. The second part of the question is the super, super important one, though, really. And I think this is why, as we've said a million times, I think like being on the ground is really important, because I've started looking back at history and stories in history and the people who get to tell the stories in history through the lens of the way that I've seen certain people jump in front of a microphone over and over again in the movements I'm currently covering, and going, all right, he's got enough. Whose story hasn't been told here? And that kind of thing, again, you build with being on the ground and showing up day after day and seeing whose stories are being told and who's not being told, and making friends across the country in places where you have people you trust who will tell you what's the part of this story that's being missed. And as Collier said, some of them will call you out pretty well, and those are the people that are the most important contacts to maintain, are the ones who will be like, hey, you missed this, and I need you to not miss this.
And I just think going to that mission of journalism, like what do we do? I think part of what we do is that we realize that politicians, institutions, they circle the wagon. That's just in their nature, and then it becomes a sort of yes man scene. And part of our job, I think all of us would say this, is to break through that and to force people to well, okay, I talked to this waitress over here, and that's not what she says. That's not what she wants, and how do you answer that, And I think that is, if you keep that in mind, that you're staging a conversation that the forces of power don't want to actually have in real life, it's a way to kind of think about how to do your work.
And that power
ignore PR email.
Or take the PR email and go, what are they not telling me?
Exactly. Yeah, that was the second thing.
But I also have sort of like a cheesy, touchy-feely answer, which is beyond being really persistent. I mean, not to the point of harassing people, but being persistent, showing up. I think, particularly with movements where there are people who don't have access to a lot of power, I think there has to be genuine curiosity, and you have to sort of view the people who you want to talk to as people, and to want to hear their stories, not just so that you can go and write it, but because you respect their story. And then this is where it gets dicey, but I don't think you can disappear after.
Yes.
You know, like so you get someone's story, you don't just say bye-bye.
Yeah.
You know, and because then why would anyone want to trust you again? But also it's just kind of like karmically dirty or something, I feel.
Also, you'll get more stories.
Yeah.
Right, but you know, and that's also again where things get complicated, of course, because when you develop a real relationship with somebody, they trust you in certain ways, and then where's the line between you as a journalist and you know, things get hairy, but you really
it's
have
hairy work.
But it is hairy work,
Yes.
and you everybody has to figure out how to navigate it.
Just to, you know, so that's interesting that you said that, Lizzy, because like I also think there's another, you know, advice I've heard. So example, like after the Sabrina Erdely Rolling Stone, you know, fiasco, like there was many articles written just about how to do that kind of sensitive journalism. And, you know, one of the pieces of advice was to say, be really explicit with the source, like, I am not your friend. I will get your story. The whole world will come down on you, and I will ghost. Like, I am not, like, the relationship we're forging here is not a permanent one.
I think it depends on the story.
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the story and the power relationship at work. And I mean, I
to
totally
be real
hear you.
honest, right, about what you can and can't do for people, and what you are and are not for people, and when, you know. But like, yeah, I don't think that ghosting on that person was the thing that needed to happen. I think like being rigorous, again, like Collier said, in service of not doing wrong by this source, being really, really rigorous and checking everything
Let's ask a question over there. Hi.
Hi. Oh, hi. I'm from Indiana. My name is Erica. I'm from Indiana University, and I'm about to graduate, but I have to take a summer class on media ethics right now. So this is great. And my question is inspired by that. We literally on Thursday, my professor said the only place you get to be political is in the voting booth. And I'm wondering, based
That's all I
off
gotta
of that,
say.
When that's obviously not going to be the case for you as a reporter, when you've accepted that about yourself, what do you do when you're interviewing people who know you disagree with them? How do you go into that situation and get the best possible interview and let them know that even though you disagree, you want to hear what they have to say?
Everything about reporting, I would argue, and you're hearing a theme, boils down. These are personal, real life, dealing with human being skills. So what do you do when you're talking to people who don't agree with you, period? You know, and I think if you're there to get their perspective, we can take arguing with them off the table, right? Like that's not gonna get you what you're there for. But treat them like a human being and say, listen, you know I don't agree with this, but like I'm trying to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I can only speak for me, in my experience, having done that hundreds of times, probably more than that, but we don't want to think about the length of life. But having done that so many times, I have never, I can't think of a time when somebody, I mean, if they pick up the phone at all, right? Like, I mean, there are people who, like, if they've just...
There are a lot of people who just don't take my calls.
Right, like, if they don't want to talk to you, they're just not going to talk to you. You know, like, that's, and they may agree with you or disagree with you, but they're just not going to talk to you. But if somebody's talking to you, chances are they're talking to you because they want you to, they want to convince you of what they have to say. So let's go at it. You know, so I personally don't think that's something to worry about. Your professor is a relic.
I love you, Kai.
They just are. It's just that is an outdated idea.
But I also feel like just in terms of objectivity, some people have always gotten to be objective and other people haven't. And it's sort of been like a code word. You know, you often find, well, we
But
can figure
even
out.
those people who claim objectivity are not objective.
No, obviously,
Right,
but it's always
exactly.
been like, you know, the people on this panel, you know, people of color, people with certain political opinions, women, like they're often the non-objective ones, right? But no one's questioning.
Well, you know, I do want to say, like, Kai, I agree with you that the industry is changing and that there's a lot of pressure being put on these old-fashioned rules. They're not all gone, right?
No.
So, like, at NPR or the New York Times, like, you are not allowed to be in a march that you have any sort of relationship to. Like, you can't hold a placard. You can't, you know, be at the Women's March, you know, for example.
And I don't do those things, actually.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
So say that, Collier. Like, what's behind that decision?
yeah, I just, you know, it's like, I haven't been in a demonstration since I was in college, actually, and I'm now 33 years old, and I graduated when I was, 21, 20. And I made the decision to do that because I was like, if I'm in this march, I know how marches make me feel. I've been going to marches since I was 2 years old, right? Like, I know how much energy I get from them being in them. I can't do that.
Yeah.
I cannot do that. I cannot go there.
Can I ask
it's
you
just too much investment.
A sort of related question is do you, and Kai, maybe you can answer this too, do you think being a person of color has put sort of a special burden on you to sort of guard that neutrality? Because, I mean, I have felt that.
I think that it used to, but I think that part of the change we're seeing is that as newsrooms diversify, this notion is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And so as more and more people of color and women and immigrants and queer people are in the workplace, refusing to make those parts of our lives secondary and say that these are somehow these are offsets from the norm of being a straight white man, then the notion of objectivity and that that the things you're in, the communities that you're part of somehow undermine your reporting is no longer sustainable.
Yeah.
That is why it is changing in the workplace I'm in, because it's just not a sustainable concept with the staff.
Yeah. Can I just add one more thing to the
Yeah,
question of
sure.
people who don't agree with you? It also very much depends on how much power that person has. If you were talking to the mayor of your city and he doesn't agree with you, it is your job to go hard. If you were talking to like when Kai's doing this story about Trump voters, your job there is to try to get the story, like I was saying before about the no voters in the Irish campaign. I'm much more interested in their story. I know what the campaigners at the top are going to say.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But so it's always the tension is how much power does this person I'm talking to have?
Hi.
Hi, my name is Amber Deneen Dodd. I'm a junior. I'm a rising senior at Mississippi State University. My question to you guys was, I know you guys talk about neutrality and trying not to act on your duality as an activist and a journalist while also having ties to the movement. And my question was, what are some things you guys do to self-separate yourself from movements or certain issues that you guys are covering that you're familiar with, but not also in familiarity with the topic, but also familiarity in experience?
Good question.
You mean if you feel like I have been through this, and so
Well, not exactly how I've been through this, but I serve three minority. I'm black, I'm queer, and I'm a woman. And when I cover these marches, I go to Mississippi State. So when I went to Jackson for their march on abortion and stuff like that, we talked about that intersection of being a woman, but also being a black woman in the poorest state in the United States. So my question, kind of combating to that, is when do you self-separate yourself when you're trying to cover these kind of topics, or do you even cover these topics?
Well, I think I think that what we've been saying and sort of the answer I'll say is you can't separate yourself, right? So you just have to come up with all these tools to still be able to do the reporting. You can't go into a situation and be like, not black today, not queer today.
Exactly.
Not a woman.
Right.
I'm not a woman anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So you just have to write down all the things. I mean, I don't know if what I've been saying is helpful, but all the things that help you to go into those situations, still maintaining all of those identities, are what's going to help you feel confident in your reporting.
I will say, just adding, you've already sort of said this, but some of this is temperamental as well for me, which is that while I actually do go to protests, because for various reasons, I'm not actually comfortable being on the front lines as an activist. And so journalism is a much more comfortable place for me. So I think if I were somebody, I think I would have a very hard time probably covering this stuff if I were deep in the muck, if I were organizing that, I think that for me feels like a bridge too far. And so I do think it is, we can talk about, can you protest, can you this, can you that, you're never going to divorce yourself from identities but I do think there is a way to maintain some sort of, I don't want to say distance, but there are different ways, you can engage in different ways with an actual movement and actually it'd be interesting to sort of write about a movement from the center of it, but then you really have to acknowledge I'm writing about its movement from the center. I'm an organizer. But
I really like that you said this about temperament, because honestly, just to be real, like, I mean, I'm not a joiner. I am
totally not a joiner.
I think there is like a personality, like you should, if you're somebody who's like, man, I really want to be in the middle of this movement, maybe you're an organizer, not a journalist, like, and maybe you're not answering your highest call, like I am never going to be, I'm not anybody's organizer.
See, I have the opposite thing where it's like, I feel I am too much a joiner, right? Really? Like when I go to London for like 2 days, like I come back with a British accent, like, because I'm just like, I'm doing this, like, and actually, it's a part of me. It's a part of me growing up that I was like, being a journalist was like acknowledging that that's a tendency I have and creating a structure to kind of push back against that. And that's like the duality that I kind of,
Oh God, yeah. No.
Let's just take a question there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I'll be a senior at Brown in the fall. And thank you so much for being here today to talk to us. My question has to do with sort of the scope you take on when you're covering movements. So I'm really interested in drawing connections between movements in different countries. And I'm wondering sort of when you're writing for an American audience, what is the worth of doing that, or when do you do that? And I was really thrilled that the story of the Rio City Councilwoman Marielle Franco blew up the way it did, because I lived in Brazil and I reported on favelas. But I was also disappointed with some ways that it blew up, because it didn't do justice to the specific ways that favela residents are marginalized. And I think it did an awesome job of sort of pointing out that anti-blackness is global and police brutality is global, and these policing institutions sort of serve the white elite in many countries. But I sort of, what's the balance there when you're writing for an American audience and you want to make things bigger than they are?
So I'm going to have these last two people ask their questions also, and then we'll take them all together, and that'll be the end. So here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kisai, and I have a question for Collier. Did I say it right? Collier. Yeah, so when you were telling your story about the article you wrote, and it was like super great and overall positive, and you kind of like had doubts about it, I was just wondering, has there ever been a time when you felt like this story is just too positive? Maybe I didn't go hard enough, like maybe I really wasn't a journalist, and then just your overall opinions about solutions-oriented journalism, because that's a big critique that a lot of people have for that kind of journalism. And as far as like keeping in touch with sources or subjects, like how much is too much? Like would it be too much to like, call them and say, oh, did you find a job yet? Or how's the status of this?
No, because
or happy
that's still
birthday.
journalism.
And like
that's still journalism, right? You're following up with your source.
Don't date your source.
Let's just last question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Minnesota, and I'm a farmer. Like, my whole family's a farmer. I'm rural America. And something that I've always struggled with is about facts, as you were saying, Collier, in that I really want to give my community a voice, in that they have different struggles than most other people. But it's similar to the whole, like, climate change argument. Should we give a voice to people who don't believe in climate change just because that's being objective? I want to give a voice to these people, but a lot of the stuff that they know isn't true. And I'm struggling with how I can put their voice out there as like a farmer and a rural community if it's not true, kind of like the climate change thing.
So a question about scope, and global scope in particular, and how you sort of frame that audience. A question about solutions-oriented journalism, and is there ever a story where you're like, this is just too, unicorns and rainbows? And then a question of how you cover communities you're from, sources you're from that, may believe in fake news, maybe have beliefs and assertions that aren't quite accurate. So, panelists.
I'll just answer the question I was asked directly. So I actually don't write positive news stories. I don't know why. I just like, it's like there's so much. I don't know why. I just don't do it. And that was one of the few times where I was like, who's a progressive mayor out there? Like, what's going on? There's this whole sea change. There's lots of progressive mayors all over America. Nobody's writing about mayors. Everybody's writing about governors. Everybody's writing about prosecutors. Like, what about mayors? And so I endeavored to do this story that was like, oh, there's this thing happening, which like once you are in the journalist world, it's like
trend piece.
Exactly.
Three is a trend.
If there's 3 people who are doing something, then it's like, oh, it's a thing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be the one to write about it. So that was like where I was coming from. And I tried in that piece to like, because all of these mayors had been newly elected. So honestly, I didn't have much to draw from with their records, right? So I was just sort of like, this is what they ran on. This is what they say they're going to do. What's good? And now, you know, I'm finding out piecemeal that like some people are unhappy with them, which is legit.
Yeah.
Maybe not everybody in Jackson, Mississippi feels that way. Maybe it's just a certain couple, two or three people within his old organizing crew, you know, like, so I'm at the point where I'm reporting this out. I'm trying to figure out like, okay, I wrote this story. I didn't think that story was wrong per se, but you need to follow up, which is the answer to the next question. Definitely call your old sources about like whether or not they found that job, whether or not they like, you know, whatever it is that the story was about, right? Because you want to know what the outcome was to the story you're writing. If it was about joblessness in Kentucky among Black folks, like, you know, well, did they find their jobs? Like, or is it still a problem? Because then that's another story, right? So you always want to follow up with sources as much as you can. And also, when you develop a relationship, then they're going to want to tell you more stories. And then you have more stories to tell. And then you develop a beat, right? And that's how you become a better journalist.
Lizzy and Sarah, you guys have both written and edited in about global movements, and so just to that question of like audience and scope, how would you
kind of back where I started today, right? So I think one of the things about Americans writing about other countries is we tend to just like drop in when something exciting happens. And this is like partly the problem, right? Like most of the places I write for don't have a budget to send me to, you know, other countries once a week
No, we don't.
or something.
Don't get any ideas.
And so, you know, I have to rely on like knowing what my lane is. Like I know a lot about certain parts of Western Europe. I know some about Latin America. I know next to nothing about Asia and next to nothing about most of Africa, and a little bit about the Middle East, but that is not my lane for a lot of reasons. So it's like, okay, there's an abortion referendum in Ireland. I've been going to Ireland since 2001. I know a bunch of people there. I know I can do this story and do it right, even though I don't live there. I know that I know enough people to get me to talk to people who are like legit, and I can get into different communities and not just go to Dublin and walk around all week, you know, interviewing people with yes buttons on, but actually like, all right, I'm gonna go to Donegal, which is like the most conservative part and the only place to vote no, and go out with canvassers there. Because that's a relationship that I built and a knowledge base that I keep up. And I was just joking this morning, I was listening to like an 1.5 hour long podcast on Spain because I was in Ireland, and therefore like a bunch of stuff just happened in Spain and Italy, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck it is. But, you know, it's keep up with what you can keep up with, and those contexts will continue to, you know, you'll see them and you'll be able to draw that. And the fact that you have this specific set of knowledge means that, like, when something happens in Brazil, you can be the one who can step up and say, like, I know this. I lived here. I know this. I've reported this from the ground. So even if now I'm back in the US, I can write about this with a context. Context is always key, that most people are going to miss. And that, I think, is super important.
I'll also add that, like, based on whatever your beat is, for mine, it's, you know, the Black justice movements. There's a strong connection with a lot of those to Palestine, for example, right? So you want to be read in as much as you possibly can be to that connection. You know, you want to know as much about your beat as possible. So if it's anti-Blackness, then look around the world and look around all of the anti-Black, you know, struggles that are the Black, like, struggles for Black justice that are happening, and then you become a person who can report on those, right?
I would also just add, you know, the reality is that, what did you say? Yeah. Oh, the voice question. Yeah. Oh, wait, yeah, I was gonna add, yeah, I don't wanna.
I'll speak.
Right, yeah, no, because I think you sort of did already with the framing issue. But I'll say one thing quickly about we are in a movement, we are in a moment where a lot of movements have overlap globally. And so I think there is actually a real role to play right now for a journalist who wants to make those connections, both on the left and the right. The sort of really frightening white supremacist stuff that's happening here is also happening all over Europe and Eastern Europe and other places. So I think there's actually quite a value at the moment. Or if we talk about sort of some of the progressive ferment that's happening in cities here, as well as the concerns that people have in cities, it's similar in many, many parts of the world right now. So yeah, I'm basically sort of cheerleading and saying, yeah, I think there's actually a real role for that. I think also a good story is a good story, not to be too reductive about it, but sometimes I think you have to telescope, or you have to sort of go back far enough to sort of try to figure out what's going to be interesting for an audience in the U.S., which isn't used to looking beyond its borders and tends to be pretty navel-gazing. So you have to sort of go back far enough. But if you find a good story, what would you want to read? At the end of the day, we talk a lot in journalism about these or we've been talking about these high concepts. But what do you want to read? What makes you curious? What makes you excited? What's the stuff that feels really relevant to you and resonant? So that's my...
Yeah. Your question about how you report on people who maybe believe things that aren't true. I would say that that's a great story, right? Like it's not the fact of that belief, but the why, the how of it. And I'm just thinking back to when I was reporting on the Tea Party, and I admit I went to those rallies like trying to shoot fish in a barrel. I was like, y'all are crazy, and I'm just gonna get some crazy quotes, and that's my story, right? But like after the third, and I heard all the, beyond the Obama's a secret Muslim, there's just a whole layer of conspiracy theories that were there. And I remember meeting this woman who was like, when they change my light bulbs from incandescent to halogen, there's gonna be a poison in them, LED bulbs. And that's Obama's done that. And I'm gonna we're all gonna die. And so they're taking away my incandescent light bulbs. And I was like, okay, this is really good, But then I was like, okay, well, why does she believe this? And we had a conversation about that, and there was a lot of websites she went to, but also I discovered that her energy costs in her community are really high, and there was a lot of that was what created a structure where that particular sort of myth became resonant. So I think anytime, and you're located in that community, right? So you have the credibility, and the connections to really explore the why of this, and I think that would be a great service.
And you don't need to be patronizing about it either.
Oh no, not at all. Yeah.
You mustn't.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And it's and this goes. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but it goes to again with what are the fundamentals of what we do, getting away from this notion of that there is some set of tools that allow us to show up as professionals, and you're dealing with human beings, and just and so whether it's somebody who disagrees with you, agree with or disagree with, when someone says something that you don't understand, that's the place to, just like you would at a dinner conversation, you'd be like, wait, what? Why? Let's explore that. You will inevitably arrive at the good story.
All right, lunch is here.
You please join me in thanking Richard, Collier, Sarah, Lizzy, and Kai.